So welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Lovely to see you all back here in the room as we take it up a step and speed up this pace, perhaps, of the panel discussions. I've noticed as well, all of you online have been commenting. One very disappointed Ahmed saying that you thought it would be more interactive. Indeed, I do apologise in advance that we did not earlier this morning have time to get to all those questions that are online. The moderators coming up throughout the day will do their best to get back to those points and will make you feel as much as involved as we are here as well in the room. For those in the room, I hope you enjoyed your coffee break and got to chat to somebody new and interesting. And now it's time to continue with our programme. And I can pass you over now to the very safe hands of Joshua Meltzer, who you met earlier this morning. Joshua Meltzer is a senior fellow and works in Global Economy and Development Programme at the Brookings Institution. And he'll be sitting down with Jerry Sheenan, that's the Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation at the OECD. He'll also be speaking to John Camara, that's the founder of the AI Centre of Excellence in Africa. And then Pedro Miguel da Costa e Silva, that's the ambassador to the European Union for Brazil, for the Brazilian mission right here in the European Union. So, gentlemen, if you would like to come up here on stage and take a seat. It's getting a little bit quieter there in the lobby, so people are gradually coming in to take their seats as we can kick off.
Am I taking your seat?
No, I'm not sitting down here. This is all in the very capable hands of Joshua. What should we expect, Joshua, from your session?
Sorry?
What should we expect from your session?
Well, this is, I think, a great opportunity to start looking at what's happening around the world, domestically, when it comes to artificial intelligence. So we opened up the conference today talking about international cooperation on artificial intelligence when it comes to governance, and we really, I think, emphasise that the first port of call for thinking about how governance is going to happen is domestically, and then we're looking at how do we build linkages and make sure that these domestic approaches are interoperable and work together. And there's a lot of innovation happening globally on AI governance. We've heard a lot, and we will hear a lot more today about what's happening in Europe on AI. I think everyone in the room is somewhat familiar with all the steps that the US is taking on AI governance, but Brazil, there's policy developments happening across Africa and globally as well. So this is going to be an opportunity to have a conversation about some of the approaches to AI governance and lessons learned and experiences that we're seeing across the AI ecosystem. So before we maybe dive into what you're seeing in terms of AI governance, I'd like to just open up with a question around how each of you are seeing AI risks and benefits. Because we jump quickly into the need for AI regulation, but this is preceded by kind of a general assessment about how you're seeing AI play out in your region and how you're seeing the opportunities and the risks at the same time. So let me open it up to the panel to respond as you see fit. Pedro, let me turn to you.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I think that in Brazil and in other developing countries, we are asking maybe some of the same questions that you're asking here in Europe or in the United States or other parts of the world. The difference maybe is where we are asking these questions from, where we're sitting, or our reality, and it's of course then we are going to give always the development perspective. When we talk about the whole issues of the digital economy, the question here is access and what this technology and technologies are going to be they use. So we want to make sure that there is equity, that it contributes to our development, to the diminishment of inequalities, poverty. So we're doing a bit the same things that other countries are doing. We have already a proposal for AI legislation in our Congress. We have multi-stakeholder committees in place. We're trying to build committees also with the participation of the private sector, academia, and government to discuss these issues. But always, just to conclude, it's always looking at it from our perspective of the needs of the Brazilian people. And of course, you will see this also in our presidency of the G20 that starts at the end of the year. All the issues that we're putting on the table are always going to be seen from this angle of what we consider the main challenges that are facing the world today, which are development-based challenges.
Okay, thanks. John?
Yeah, thank you very much for being here. I think I'm going to speak for Africa in general, which I try not to, but for this particular occasion, I will try.
I think they just leaned in a little bit
to represent 54 countries. So a lot of the African countries are, racing to write policies, policy around AI policy, AI strategy policies, without really a clear understanding why they're writing the policy, because that's pretty much what everybody's saying. So, shoving down the conversation around policy to the rest of the emerging markets, that you also have to write policy around governance, you have to write policy. What are you policing? That's the first thing. Then when you look at the risk, one of the things that we're talking about is, where is the role of self-governance? A self-governance framework that really could be the fundamental basis, because the actors in the AI space are humans. Is there a possibility to use the value of education within a self-governance framework as part of risk mitigation, or the risk that we talk about when we look at policies around risk and innovation as well? Because if you can provide self-governance in innovation, you might actually allow innovation to continue, while risk is also part of that, and audited risk. So we're seeing a race across the continent to sort of adopt a global North strategy of let's also regulate, something that doesn't exist yet in our continent. And that's a bit of a problem, because we're not really thinking through the context of where we are as a continent across Africa. You can group Africa into multiple different, if you go to places like Mali, what is AI? If you go to South Africa, yes, there's AI. Then if you go to other places in the continent, what are you talking about AI? There are other fundamental problems. So now everybody is now just driving through this one agenda, and we have one major problem: unemployment for over 60% of young people. Could this technology help us solve unemployment issues? So that's kind of like the conversation in the continent right now, which is a very interesting light bulb.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and there's a lot there that I'd like to dig back into. But Jerry, let me just turn it over to you. The OECD's been doing a lot of work in different aspects of AI. Up to you how you want to approach this, but do you want to sort of kickstart in how the OECD is sort of seeing risks and opportunities from AI?
Yeah, and actually I appreciate the way you asked the question, because I think we need to focus on both the benefits and the risks of AI, right? So we've heard today, we recognize there are great benefits to improve education through AI, improve healthcare through AI, improve overall worker productivity through the use of AI. We need to keep that in front of us as well, as we recognize that there are risks. There are the safety risks that we've talked about a lot this morning. I think that can demand some issues of regulation and of AI systems. There are also other risks associated with, right, mis and disinformation being promulgated or distributed through AI systems. There are risks to privacy and others that we've seen in our work to date. And we need to try to find ways to bridge the gap between these. So what we've done at the OECD to date, and you've seen the OECD recommendation on AI, which is now approaching its fifth year since it was promulgated back in 2019. And it tries to address both of those sides of the equation, if you will, right? There are recommendations in this about investing more in research and development for AI. There's more about investing in skills and skills development, which can help improve the adoption and the promulgation of AI, at the same time that we try to adhere to principles of transparency in AI systems, the data sets that they're trained on. We look for safety and security issues and have agreement that those need to be addressed squarely, and that we look for applications of AI that are going to improve society and contribute to sustainable development goals. What we see across countries, we've been focusing a lot, again, in the discussion this morning, on what's happening in the AI Act, the US executive order, and so forth. These build on what's been a growing set of policies around AI that also try to both promulgate and develop AI applications, as well as put some constraints around them. We have something at the OECD, it's the OECD AI Policy Monitor. since 2017, when there were just a handful of policies across countries, we've seen now we're tracking more than 1,000 different policies across 70 different countries that move in a number of different directions, right? Trying to promulgate and promote use in health and healthcare, for example, at the same time bringing in cross-ministerial governance processes to ensure that there's coordination of effort and an awareness of some of the concerns and risks that are taking place. I think as we see this kind of promulgation of policy making, there's also a call for greater international coordination, right? How do we assure that we're working from common principles, common approaches, as was mentioned earlier today, even common definitions. What do we mean by an AI system? It's an area we've been working on quite actively, even right now at OECD, and trying to develop a new and updated definition of an AI system to include in a revised version of our AI recommendation, and hoping to do that in time to influence many of the policy development activities that are going on across the world right now.
Great. That's fantastic. One of the things I think which is maybe worth emphasising, which is coming up already, is this idea of AI policy, which is a bigger umbrella than AI regulation. So there's a lot of activity happening across Africa. You were talking about that as well, which is part of its regulation, but part of it is the other steps that governments and others are taking to think about the broader ecosystem for AI. How do you develop and enable it? Pedro, when you look at what's going on in Brazil, and you can think about Brazil solely, or you can look at maybe what's happening more broadly in the region, but where is AI policy at in Brazil? Where do you see the opportunities? What is the government doing? Where are the gaps that need to be filled? Maybe it's on the capital investment side, maybe it's on the skills development side. How is the government thinking about the broader kind of opportunity space in Brazil for AI, and what is happening in there?
To give you a short answer, I would choose a few issues. I think one fundamental issue that is necessary for AI, but not only, is infrastructure, making sure that everybody has the necessary infrastructure to use the digital tools, and including AI. You touched about the other one, which is having capacity, which means educational, technical training. That is also being envisaged. I have already spoken about the need to involve all of society. And then there are issues that have already been mentioned here by you and by some of the panelists, which have been chosen as areas that we're working on, but there are others, of course, that are going to come up. Health was mentioned, smart cities, industry 4.0, health, and then simplifying the lives of citizens by using AI to make their interaction with governments better, it's a big agenda for a country such as Brazil. So how are you going to use AI to make to diminish bureaucracy, which is a major problem, and make sure that you can help. Those would be some of the examples that I would use. But of course, there is also research. But you have to be realistic here. Who are going to? I think countries such as Brazil, and at least in the first stage, are going to be much more users. And we'll have to discuss the issue of access than developers. But we are also envisaging a series of research centers and initiatives to generate this kind of capacity for Brazil, of also generating AI solutions for our needs.
So this is a fantastic, I think, segue maybe into building a question around. One of the things you mentioned, which sort of caught my attention, but I just want to use this as a building block, was what are the AI opportunities for jobs in Africa? Mm-hmm. Because the debate in the US, and I think the developed world generally, tends to be a lot more focused on the risk to jobs. And I think it's a great opportunity to maybe hear from you about how you're thinking about the job opportunity side, but also, you know, picking up, I think, on some of the building blocks that Pedro was referring to in terms of infrastructure and skills and R&D. What's that? How do you see that space in Africa? What are the needs for cooperation and investment to really make this an opportunity in Africa?
No, I think the first thing is the opportunity for job creation. I think AI would present a massive the whole construct of AI, data science, data engineering will provide a massive opportunity, but also it will help the continent actually become probably one of the leaders in open data networks, because we don't really have a lot of data, so we are just providing infrastructure to build these data frameworks. We don't have all these silos that you have in Europe or America, so we have the opportunity to actually build from scratch something completely different and maybe show an idea of things that could work. And that obviously means that you create a lot of jobs within that network, and means that we have to go down to capacity, where you truly develop capacity across the entire ecosystem. Now back to, if you think about capacity, that's where the opportunity for self-governance comes in, because as you are building capacity, you can actually train people on understanding the risk involved in doing specific things in AI, because at the end of the day, somebody spoke earlier on, the engineers are the ones who do the work. They don't understand the construct of what you're talking about sometimes. So if you sort of like take that opportunity across the spectrum of both from a regulation, job creation perspective, we already have problems of infrastructure. We know that, but where the problem of infrastructure also represents an opportunity for us to look at how we build policies then that allow us, to create the right type of infrastructure in a much more regulated environment that allows AI to thrive. So the continent is going through a digital transformation. That is the key thing to note. We are finally transforming digitally. So many products, so many government services, so many solutions, young people. So we're at a junction where we don't have the legacy frameworks that you guys have here. I grew up in Ireland. I grew up in Dublin, so I know what happened in the 80s and 90s before moving back to Africa. So I've seen where you can transform if you don't have all those legacies that you have to deal with, but if you have clarity and the intent. It's very important, because when you think about the intent of why you do something, so the intent of regulation, the intent around trustworthiness, the intent around responsibility, who is the owner of that context of intent? And just to end, if you think about it as a movie, there is the influencer, who is the governing body, that is the Grammy Awards. Then there is the producer, who owns the movie. There's the actor. Then there's the consumer, who just watches the film. So where do you belong? Who are you? So for Africa, we are just watching the movie. We're consumers. And as long as you're consumers, you will be retro-engineered to exactly where they want you to be. And we can't let that happen to us again. So the opportunity for us to shape our own narrative as part of a global convergence is where, and one of those narratives is we need to use this technology to create jobs. So we call it AI for social and commercial good.
Mm-hmm. Great. No, that's fantastic. Let's get back to some of that shortly. But Jerry, you mentioned the OECD AI Observatory, and the OECD has got this sort of great perch, I guess, where you are gathering a lot of information and data on what is happening from a broad AI policy perspective in a range of countries. Do you want to just get into that a little bit more in terms of like what you're seeing, not both on the regulatory front, but also what you're seeing on skills development, venture capital development? What's happening from your perspective?
A lot of upward moving curves here, I think, in all of those areas. So yes, we do some real-time casting of data that we use, in fact, some AI systems and other curation processes to pull together to look at investments in research and development across countries, to look at the outputs, right? We've seen incredible growth in the number of research publications, not surprisingly, related to AI. We've seen incredible increases in venture capital investments in AI. I think at the latest numbers we have, about $110 billion US dollars in venture capital investment. And we see skills development also taking place. But I think building on what has been said, right, we also see some great regionalizations around those. So just with the venture capital figures, I think out of that $110 billion, about $68 billion of that is in the US alone. The numbers in Europe, I think, are down in the $10 billion, right, across the European Union. And China is in between, maybe at around 15 billion US dollars there. Similarly, research publications, not surprisingly, right, concentrated around G7 countries, and skills equally, right, greatly among G7 countries, but with great variation even between them. I think we see almost twice as many workers in the U.S. reporting that AI skills are important to their jobs than we've seen across the OECD countries. So I think these issues of kind of what we've termed in the past digital divides, right, are again important for us to address in the context and the era of AI, noting that it relates, I think as John was just saying, right, to basic broadband availability issues, which we know have great national differences. We're doing some work now at the OECD trying to understand subnational, regional differences. An incredible variation in penetration of broadband between urban and rural areas in virtually all countries. We see, even at the firm level, where we're doing some additional analysis, it tends to be larger firms that have been able to adopt AI more quickly. Also, a number of young firms, the startups, right, that are moving quickly in this space. And even among those who are producing AI, right, there were concerns a couple of months ago about access to the GPUs that are needed to build new AI systems. All of these, right, represent and reflect some challenges about growing digital divides. When we know, right, from some of the concerns we've seen so far about discrimination and bias and so forth in AI algorithms, we need a very diverse, we need a very inclusive community of stakeholders, countries, socioeconomic groups within countries and others that are participating in, contributing to AI developments, and then certainly participating in an economy that, just as it's become more digitally driven, is going to become more AI driven in the future.
So let's move to, there's a lot happening globally. We started this panel by talking a little about the variation in domestic AI governance experiments, both at the regulatory front, but also across this whole range of areas, whether it's skills development, infrastructure, capital, and so forth. What we also started this conference with this conversation, I think, around learning from domestic governance experiences. I guess my question to you, Pedro, is, are we developing the tools and the mechanisms to learn from each other's experiences with domestic AI policy, domestic AI governance? Is Brazil looking anywhere in particular when it thinks about its own approach to AI policy? Is it looking to the EU, to the US? Is the OECD regionally? Do we need to do more in that space?
We're doing all of that, I think, because we have excellent work with the OECD. We favor very much engagement at the international level, at the UN, and all the initiatives that are looking for multilateral solutions, cooperative solutions. And since I'm the Brazilian ambassador to the EU, I have to speak about what we're doing with the EU. And we have a digital dialogue with the EU. But recently, you know, we had this EU and Latin American and the Caribbean summit here. And one of the initiatives that was launched there is a digital alliance. And we're having meetings of this digital alliance. We're going to have one now in November in Colombia. One of the issues that is on the table is AI. So I think the key word here is engagement, cooperation, dialogue. That is fundamental for a country like Brazil, and I think this applies to other developing countries. And I think that maybe one thing that is complicated for us is if we start hearing that some countries want to decide what are going to be the rules. I think that the best solution would be for all of us to try to work some of these issues together.
Great. John, what are you seeing firstly, let's start with Africa, in terms of processes for engaging and learning from each other's sort of thinking, experiences and challenges across the continent?
I think one of the fundamental things that we're seeing is the continent, a lot of countries are definitely embracing the idea of how do we regulate AI, how do we make policies from a global perspective, because but there is the area of where most countries are saying, okay, well, let's learn from, you know, a lot of countries, US, UK, EU, but none of them are truly saying, what is the context for us in this learning? And the second question is, also, are you listening when we tell you things about our context? And I don't see a lot of that happening. It's a very one-sided learning exercise, and there's no, like one of the listeners asked, interactive learning or interactive exercise. There's no interactive learning process here. It's a very one-sided learning process. We learn, then we go back, then we, and this is traditionally what has been happening to emerging markets, Africa specifically, for years. So we're at a cusp of a massive digital divide that if we just adopt what we learn from you, it's not going to help us in any way, shape, or form. We have other fundamental problems. I was telling Beth earlier on. We have other problems that we have to deal with: poverty, women. So we have to deal with all these problems in parallel, as well as dealing with AI. So we don't have the luxury of saying let's just only focus on this other problem because this AI thing just hit us in the face now while we're still solving all this or grappling with other continental issues. So I think there has to be an interactive form of learning. I think African countries are making the effort to try to learn from our other global partners, but I don't think there's a reciprocation of really understanding where the continent or where different kind of countries in the continent are and how to also listen or maybe allow them to actually speak rather than telling them what to say. Not telling them what to do, you're telling them what to say. And this is engineered by so many other factors, which is why I talked about the intent. And the intent by who? Because, if I was at the AI for Good 4 years ago in Geneva, and I had the same conversation on stage. And 4 years later, you ask yourself a simple question. What has been the trigger in the past 10 to 12 months that has triggered this massive need for this regulation? So something happened. We know what happened. There's a bunch of other things behind the scene that also happened. So it's not necessarily the cloud that we see about, but there are triggers that have triggered this conversation. AI has been existing. We've been doing it for years. It's been happening. We've been trying to get regulators to come to the table and regulate it so that over time, so that we have a progressive regulatory framework rather than a slap you on the wrist regulatory framework where, I run an AI company. It's the same thing as the other guy was talking about earlier on. So now I'm trying to figure out what to do next. But we've been having this conversation for 5 years. Why? So I think it's really important when we're also talking about that two-way approach. And mostly, a lot of African regulators also need education because most of them don't actually understand what they're regulating. Mm-hmm. So investing, we talk about some of the problems, looking at when a lot of organizations or European Union are investing in Africa to say, well, we're going to invest in you to help write a policy. Well, you're giving somebody money to write a policy who probably doesn't understand why it is actually. Why don't you first train him a little bit better to, why don't you invest in those type of things that actually allow for a much better engagement, when everybody sits at the table and we create equilibrium. So that's what I see as, because also it will stifle a lot of African startups if that conversation is not a two-way street.
Yeah, I think this notion of a two-way street, interactive learning, is actually a really good sort of theme for how we think about building a conversation around artificial intelligence going forward. So let me take that theme and ask you, Jerry, the OECD, in part, one of the things I think it can do really well is to pool domestic experiences and encourage learning internationally. Do we have the mechanisms in place to do that at the scale and in the way that we need to do it for AI policy?
Yeah, I think we have a good platform that we're building from for doing that. So both in terms of the engagement we have literally around our tables, our AI working group has been getting together this week for one of its biannual meetings. And this is an opportunity and a place to share experiences with policy development, with problems that countries are seeing, even among the OECD membership, where there's quite a bit of variation, right, in terms of the capacity, the roles that countries play as developers of AI systems versus users of AI systems. Of course, we've expanded quite a bit in our engagement beyond the OECD. We have been working very closely with G20 countries. We have a number of non-member countries who join us in these conversations. I think we're looking at ways now to work more closely with Africa as well in the context of this work, because it is both informative for us, as John was saying. It's a two-way conversation. We as OECD, we as the member countries learn from that, and we can adapt and adjust policies as well. we have been trying to build a lot of the infrastructure, right, at OECD to help support some of the sharing of experience. So I mentioned the OECD Policy Observatory, for example, which is available to all of you, right, and available to policymakers in countries to see what is happening. We are building, in fact, we'll be launching, hopefully by the end of this week, a new AI incidents monitor, right? How do we build evidence on the kinds of incidents and risks that are emerging around AI, whether it's safety issues and concerns, it's mis and disinformation and so forth, so that we have more of an evidence base on which to make good policy going forward. We have been working as well on efforts to develop a classification scheme for AI systems, again, recognizing that there are... I don't know what I just said, but...
Hopefully not an AI
incident.
risk.
Do we have an incident that we need to monitor now, or are we okay?
Okay.
All right. On that note, let me just to finish up. I mean,
Yeah.
to say we have been looking at a classification system as well that'll help identify the risks and challenges and concerns around different types of AI systems that are being developed. And as I mentioned, we're now in the process, as our AI recommendation is about 5 years old, which is, I think was said at the opening in AI years, is about 50 years old. It's time to renew and reflect on what we've learned from the experience over the last 5 years with that. We will be doing that again in broader consultation, again with the member countries and beyond, to try to understand experiences, challenges in implementation, and we hope to have a revision of that to promulgate in the next year.
Great. One of the panels that we're going to have that I'll moderate later today is on China and China's development in AI. Obviously a very important actor, both on the technology side and on the governance side. And I've got a couple of questions I actually want to pull out here from some of the online audience, which are as we're looking at AI governance models globally and learning from them, to what extent, Pedro, is Brazil looking at what China's doing, drawing lessons, drawing inspirations from their approach to AI governance?
We have excellent relations with China, like we have with other actors that are leaders in this field, such as the EU. I mentioned in my first intervention that we have a legislation that is being discussed in Congress, and it's based significantly on the EU legislation. And we also have excellent dialogue and relation with the United States and with other players. So I wouldn't single out any actor. I think we're trying to help and work with all those that are involved in this issue.
Great. How are you seeing the China kind of approach to AI as an inspiration or not for what's happening in Africa?
I mean, I think that obviously there's a lot of Chinese influence in Africa in terms of services and opportunity sector, but what I call interoperable regulation. Right? So regulation has to have interoperability, where the regulation that works in a specific domestic environment, if another regulation from another, and we can find an interoperable nature for both regulations to be able to speak to each other, taking the specific pointers that allows for us to build a framework where everyone is represented, and without necessarily taking away the the sovereign rights of the state itself to be part of its own decision making processes. So But from a global governance perspective, the interoperable nature of regulation allows for different regulations to be able to speak to themselves. And I think that's something we should all think about exploring. We talk about it a lot in other sectors, but it could be a potential opportunity in this space. And I think China, especially again, what they, the work doing in Africa, even with the BRICS nations. So, but I think one of the key important principles is the drive for capacity development that they're also doing. So, in my view, it's really left to the rest of the countries to also look at, where do they want to play in the emerging markets? Do you just want to keep playing at let's help you make policy level, or let's help you really figure out how to create economic value out of what you have? And that is the, the Chinese global North conversation right now.
Yeah. Jerry, over to you, how you want to sort of address but the extent you want to just sort of provide a bit of a framework for how does China engage with the OECD? What's that relationship like?
Yeah, well, China engages in different ways with different parts of the OECD, right? So they're much more engaged with us in areas of science and technology policies than in areas around digital economy policies and AI. That said, we recognize that they're a significant player in the AI space. If you look in our policy observatory and some of the other data we collect, it's a country that we are monitoring as best we can developments in. We do have engagement with China through the G20 and other multilateral fora that we can make use of. And I think when it comes to work that OECD does in areas like recommendations and these soft legal instruments, they are among like-minded countries. And I think that's where some of the challenge has come in bringing them into the discussion so far. Noting as well that the G20 has adopted essentially and modified the OECD principles on AI. So again, they've got a reach out to China. They've got reach out to other countries well beyond the OECD membership, which I think is a very productive thing in helping us get a common global position in place on basic principles around AI.
Yep. When maybe to tie this back to a couple of sort of like practical, pragmatic kind of solutions here. When you think about the opportunities that are happening in Brazil around AI, the risks and the regulatory direction that Brazil is heading, what are maybe one or two things that you would like to see happen in terms of international cooperation around these issues? It may be around skills development, it may be around infrastructure, it may be around cooperating in terms of harmonizing regulation that would work, that would be really beneficial from a Brazilian perspective.
Well, I would start with an issue that I should have mentioned, but that I forgot to, which is an issue that was mentioned already here, the issue of misinformation and disinformation. This is an important issue for us, and also for the preservation of democracy. So when we talk about all the digital agenda now with AI and its possibilities, to put it diplomatically, this issue is one issue that I think that we need to work with other partners in the international arena. But I would also insist, like I said in one of my interventions, on the issue of infrastructure and on the issue of access. And this was, I think, an issue that he mentioned also in relation to Africa. It's a fundamental issue for us. If you are going to have a realistic discussion about AI, from our point of view, you need to discuss access, and you need to discuss how we are going to be able to use AI and not just be the objects, right, but be the actors and participants. So I think that if we can generate international cooperation on that, but also involving academia, the private sector, I think that maybe that's the way to go. And it's a whole of society approach. At least in the case of Brazil, this is a discussion that is happening with the participation of the whole of society, because I think it touches on everybody's interest. So that would be my response, not being an expert in an event of experts.
No, I mean, this is great. I think this is exactly what we need. I think misinformation, disinformation, and infrastructure and access are broadly core building blocks to opportunity and addressing risks. I think that covers it perfectly. John, I mean, there's a lot of need in Africa, clearly, and you've outlined some of that. But where, if you were to think about very pragmatic next steps where international cooperation can really be supportive of the AI opportunity space as much as the regulatory space as well, what would you think about?
No, I think just taking from one of the comments he made about $110 billion, maybe we get like 0.1% of that, or maybe not. So I'm not a politician, so I'll speak straight. And obviously, we have a lot of young people. We have unemployment. The Irish minister talked about, people lost, in the last industrial revolution in Ireland, people losing jobs, but then with digitalization and capacity development, new jobs were created in Ireland. Now, I'm a product of that. We have a hugely highly skilled economy. So, investing in capacity development in this AI space for a lot of African countries is a critical fundamental part, even for regulation, because in that capacity, as you are providing that knowledge to people, you can teach them about the principles of ethics and responsibility as part of that. So you're really creating from the ground up a self-governing agenda as well, and you're also helping these economies create economic value, which makes them begin to see the real potential of AI. I mean, we've trained over 350 AI engineers. We've created over 347 jobs, high-paying jobs in the continent in less than 2 years. That's, that is a proof of testament, and those people are going on to do that. You can galvanize that economy and still achieve the same agenda in parallel. So capacity for me, and the same capacity for regulators, again in Africa, the policymakers providing the same capacity for knowledge to make the right decision, not to stifle innovation. So that we are, and yes, infrastructure definitely is a problem, but I think, the fundamental around education and capacity, even for institutions and our knowledge centers, which are the universities, without that, even as much as we make all the great regulations, I think we have lost a huge part of the population, because that's also what drives access back and forth with people.
Jerry, any final observations on sort of what is missing at the moment in terms of the international agenda around AI cooperation?
Well, I don't know if it's missing. In fact, this is the critical time, as we're seeing, I think, for multilateral action, right? That's why we see the OECD is engaged, the UN is engaged. We had the UK summit, as was mentioned. We've got G7 and G20 and other groups that have put AI, front and center on their agendas in the current moment. And I think we do need that kind of conversation, because we are right at an inflection point. The move into generative AI has created new opportunities and new challenges, and we need to kind of reaffirm our notion of having a human-centric, rights-oriented approach to AI and AI governance, and that needs to be done collectively. I think, and in doing that, we can identify, some of the safety issues, some of the red lines, some of the mutually agreed areas in which we need greater cooperation. I think, as we were saying earlier, we also need to recognize that the policy development around AI, we need to think broadly about it, right? There are issues around labor markets, there's education policy, there's product regulation policies, there's others that and we need to be attentive to issues of digital divides and AI divides. So we need policy to help us approach those issues. It's not necessarily regulation, it's a range of different government interventions that can help us bring about the AI-informed society that I think we want to achieve. And maybe the final point is we also need to when we think about multilateralism, it's not just government to government, right? We do need, I think others have said this, we need the engagement of all stakeholders. We've been working at OECD through an expert network of stakeholders from industry, from academia, from policy researchers and others, to help us become better informed and to help better inform that community so that we can prepare not just the policy-making world, but society as well for what is to come, and help us navigate some of the challenges that we're going to propose. So I think that multilateral, multi-stakeholder approach is what we need to build on and reinforce at this point in time.
Great. Thank you. Do we have time for a question, or we need to move on to the next panel? So hold your questions. If you have them, there's lots of other panels to come where those questions can be asked. Let me thank the panelists for their excellent contributions and comments and responses to my questions. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you so much, Joshua, and thank you so much to your panelists. It was so interesting there to get the perspective from the ambassador from Brazil, to get the perspective as well from Africa and to hear the words of John Camara there saying, one takeaway I will bring from that panel, I think, was you'll stifle a lot of African startups if you do not have a two-way conversation. So gentlemen, thank you so much for that and for broadening the perspective here in the room. And apologies, by the way, for that rude beep that we heard there, that technical difficulty glitch, but things are smooth again and we can get on with our panel. So next, it's time to pass the microphone on to Andrew Wyckoff. He spent most of his career at the OECD in Paris, but now he's a senior visiting fellow at the School of Transnational Governments at the EUI. Welcome, great to see you. Andrew will be sitting down with Eva Meidel, who's already in the room there. She is, of course, an MEP from the European People's Party and also is the rapporteur of the EU AI Act on behalf of the European Parliament's ITRE Committee, the Industry Committee. So, Eva, we're delighted to have you here as well with us. Andrew will also be speaking to Marjorie Buxer, that's the Executive Director at the Digital Society Initiative, Chatham House. Welcome to you. And also remotely, good morning and welcome to Yoichi Ida, the Assistant Vice Minister at the Ministry for Internal Affairs and Communications over in Japan, the chair of the Hiroshima process. So welcome. Great to see you. So take it away, Andrew. Looking forward to the panel.
Thank you. Are we in Jeremy? I think we're
Yes.
missing Jeremy.
Who are we missing?
Yeah.
Jeremy, our panelist.
We're missing Jeremy, of course. Yeah. And last but not least, Jeremy is, of course, the head of Microsoft EU policy here in Brussels. Jeremy Rollison. You're also very much on this panel, so you're very welcome.
Yeah, just like
There you go. Okay, Andrew.
Okay, so we're going to move from national and how to share these experiences amongst each other to the international level. Some of these multi-stakeholder and multilateral groups that Jerry was just referring to, which I see as kind of the glue for pushing something forward. And yeah, last week was a tremendous step forward on many of these initiatives. And the question I'm going to ask, we've got our great panel here. We've got Eva, who will cover the EU, who's definitely been a front runner. Marjorie, who comes from the UK, but from Chatham, it's much larger than that, but the UK just had a big event. Ida-san, my old colleague, Yoichi, who wears many hats. Yoichi is leading the G7 Hiroshima process under the Japanese presidency. He is the chairperson of the OECD's Committee on Digital Economy Policy, and Japan is the exiting presidency of the Global Partnership on AI. And last but not least is Jeremy, who comes from what we affectionately call big tech these days, Microsoft, which really has the global view. Now, each of you have a different perspective. I'm just curious, and we'll start with you, Eva, because Eva's got a bit of a time issue. Just to say, Eva, where do you see the state of play right now? How do these pieces fit together, and what's going forward?
First of all, thank you for having me today. I think over the past week, we have seen a very big step forward, certainly something that probably none of us expected that we'll be seeing a year ago. I think what we've seen is that world leaders are trying to get ahead on AI and to show that they're in control in one way or another. And on first sight, the news from last week do not sound in a way very promising for the possibility of a global democracy-minded AI pact, if we want to call it this way. And that is because many have painted some sort of a striking divergence between the approaches that are out there, between the EU, which is going for more binding rules, and the rest of the world, which is opting for more voluntary measures. But I don't think that the picture is that black and white necessarily. There are clearly some long-established differences in the way we govern, in our philosophies of governance and technological priorities. But I think there are some positive news out there because I think we are seeing converging objectives. It is clear, first and foremost, that the Western democracy agree on more things rather than on the things that they disagree. And this is when it comes to values on transparency, accountability, fairness, are all concepts all present in all the major initiatives. And maybe more concretely, I would boil it down to about 2-3 areas of convergence. First of all, when it comes to short-term risks, within the EU AI Act, we are addressing those short-term risks in our high-risk category. If we look at the White House executive order, it focuses on preventing discrimination and bias throughout all of its agencies. So very similar in the way we're looking at this. And if this is implemented correctly, I think this is some sort of quite of a big deal in that space. Then when it comes to foundational models, all the initiatives that were brought forward last week focus on the most powerful AI models. And certainly, as many of you have been following, what the EU AI Act is doing is the same. We are trying to focus only on these powerful foundational models. All of this is to say that I think what the EU is doing is not diametrically opposed, or what we are all doing is not diametrically opposed to what the Western democratic allies are doing. In a way, I think it's complementary, what we are doing currently. But saying this, I also have to say that there is still a long way to go from here. This is why, as being one of the negotiators of the EU AI Act, I have always been very focused on enhancing this international cooperation and working with our partners and putting it as probably one of the key priorities. Because my worry that over the past year, it's been more of a competition, who's going to announce first, who's going to announce something that's more headline material, so to say. And I think in a moment of time where competitiveness, we're struggling in the area of competitiveness and innovation, we need to strike further cooperation with our international allies. It's less about competition in the regulatory space, and it's more about cooperation.
Thank you, Eva. And that's a perfect setup for Marjorie, if I can, because the UK kind of came out of nowhere a little bit, taking on the global stage with the summit last week. Some saw this as competition, but at the end of the day, it brought together a wider range of countries than we've seen before. Marjorie, I'm just interested in what's your state, what do you see as the state of play right now? Where are we?
Thank you, Andy, and it's lovely to be with all of you here in Brussels, slightly drier than the UK. I have to start with a weather note because, you know, I work in the UK, that's what we do. But I think there's two ways to think of this question. If you look at the state of AI governance, and especially if you compare to other fields, we're still very much in the infancy, especially from a global lens. We lack the regulation, the institution, the process to deploy and develop AI safely. However, if you look at the common journey, at the evolution, now this is interesting, and I think both Eva and Jerry mentioned a turning point, and I would agree. And as a researcher, I would describe this evolution in 3 main questions. When we start looking at it in Chatham House about 7 years ago in technology policy from international affairs, that was still very niche. And the main question about AI was, should we regulate AI, if at all? And that was only, you know, a few years ago, where mainly people think that policymakers shouldn't intervene in the AI innovation process. Then when the increased perceived risk of AI came another question, which is now how? How do we regulate AI? And many countries are still very much grappling with this question, but I think what we've seen is, in addition to this, and I think the current main question is, how do we regulate AI together? And for the first time, countries really agree that because of the transnational nature of the risk, an independent national framework is insufficient. And you really need to develop collective response that are more than just sharing best practices. And in this context, the Bletchley Declaration, as you mentioned, Andy, that was signed last week, I think is a diplomatic success, not only for the UK, but I would say for the international community. And why is that? I think the first element is that there's an agreement that in addition to national risk-based policies, there should be international cooperation. And I think that's really a departure from the AI race or AI competition narrative that has been dominating, at least at the beginning of this year, I would say, the debate around AI. The second reason why I think it's significant is the countries, 28 countries signed it, and the European Union as well, in addition, which includes US and China. And that's an unprecedented constellation of actors, really. And finally, there's also the notion of continuity with South Korea and France offering to host the summit next year. So in a way, I think I'm very excited, maybe as you can tell by my voice, and when it comes to AI governance, I think the reality is we're still facing the Everest in terms of what we need to achieve, but at least we're looking in the right direction and we're potentially more equipped to do so.
Thanks. And so this takes me to Yoichi Ida. And Yoichi, other than many of the hats you wear, you also bring an Asian perspective, which we haven't heard too much of so far today. Yoichi, where do you see things? What's the trajectory going forward?
Okay, thank you very much, Andy, and for the question, and thank you very much for having me online. Actually, if you allow me to go back to the beginning of the discussion, I would like to remind you that Japan started or proposed this international discussion on global AI governance or global AI regulation in the back in the year 2016. When Japan took the previous round of G7 presidency. And we proposed to the discussion, international discussion on AI governance, because we wanted to have a more harmonized governance structure or framework across countries, because the very first intention of our government is, as many of you recognize, Japan is the front runner of aging society, and also we are a shrinking country. So we will have less human capacity, less workforce, and that is why we wanted to make the full use of AI and new technologies in the society to promote not only the economic growth, but also the societal development. So the intention of the discussion is probably in many cases common with other Asian countries to promote the deployment or development of new technology and deployment of the technology into the society, so that the new technologies can bring a lot of benefit to the all nationalities. And we recognized, that cannot be achieved by the players or business or people in the society, economy, only in one country, but we recognized we need to work together with the colleagues and partners from around the world. So that is why we promoted the discussion on AI governance, not only in the framework of G7, which was proposal was succeeded by the following presidencies of Italy and Canada, and the discussion led to a global partnership on AI. Also, we started this work with OECD, which the work led to OECD AI recommendation and principles. So even after 2019, EU colleagues started discussing the legally binding framework for AI regulation. We wanted to avoid, the fragmentation of the governance across the countries, and that is why we started once again the discussion on AI governance in our G7 presidency this year, and that covered also the governance of generative AI and foundation models. So G7 started the initiative called the Hiroshima Process, which agreed at the end of October the guiding principles and the code of conduct for advanced AI system developers. And we are now trying to implement those 11 principles and corresponding actions and measures in code of conduct into actions, actually. And we are now trying to act together with the partners beyond the G7. So this kind of opportunities is very, very precious for us, G7 members, to share our ideas and actions and together and take the common steps forward to the future. So thank you very much. That is our thought at this moment.
Thank you, Yoichi, and thanks for reminding that actually the G7's been at this a while, but particularly underneath Japanese leadership, and I don't know if that's always recognized. But speaking of a company that's been at it for a while, is Microsoft, and you've got. I was talking last night. I've watched Microsoft over too many years, but wow, you really have a global perspective, and you're way out there on AI now. Jeremy, can you give me your point of view on what do you make of all these governance initiatives over the last week?
We're not surprised. This is a year that things have gotten real, as others have mentioned. I think it's something happy to see that others may have noticed. We've certainly placed a lot of investments and bets in this space. And it's going to be a competitive space. And as excited as we are about the technology and what it can do, we don't want to minimize the challenges and the risks that are there. It's just as important to make sure that we have those benefits available to as many as possible as it is to have the rules in place to mitigate against some of the harms and the risks. So we've been very supportive of the G7 efforts, and particularly want to thank the Japanese leadership on that side. It's been a terrific outcome to see just what a multilateral, multi-stakeholder approach has gone into that. And it's important to keep in mind that these are guiding principles. Ultimately, we love the idea of the code of conduct to set norms where then domestic legislation naturally could fit underneath. And I think what's important there is the interoperability of regulatory frameworks that ideally would lead to an interoperability of the systems they're regulating. And once again, there's space in there for differentiation, but you want to get to a space where these are ecosystems at the end of the day. There's different players involved across AI. It's not like shipping a particular product. And you can think about the ways we need to make sure that travels across borders. So you can take inspiration from things like, we like to point to the International Civil Aviation Organization, where we don't have to refit planes in the air to make sure that they can take off from one destination and land in another, but there still is scope for different national approaches to that space. A couple of guiding principles that we think are important is reflected even in some of the EU discussions naturally, but focus where the risk is. And the focus currently at G7 level and others, and as Yoichi mentioned, is really on these advanced systems and highly capable. Let's focus on the tip of the spear and where the the biggest risk of harm might be, or I call it the scariest side of these things. If we get agreement there, as this technology evolves, that is a more flexible way of looking at where we're going to have to come up with more case, sector, app-specific type rules. But having that meeting of the minds is going to be tremendously important, as this isn't a technology that just comes from one box. You have different developers involved in that. You need availability of cloud infrastructure, the different tools. So as long as the rules are reflecting that risk-based approach, where I think you have a large agreement. If you look at the discussions in the EU, it's been largely focused on that. It goes back and forth each day, it seems to me, but that's what we're at right now in the Brussels process. I think it's been tremendous to see that meeting of the minds at the international level, and we're going to continue to support that. And I also think it's important to say that it's not really a destination, but it is going to be a journey that we're on. Each of these deliverables are not going to be the end of AI regulation, but it's a great start. So.
Thanks. Well, speaking of great start, got to give credit to the European Union. I think
was first the one to put pen to paper, right?
No, I think to get real about this, and I know where I was at the OECD, all of a sudden the nature of the conversation changed, in I think a good way. So, but let me tell you, you were the front runner, kudos, but now that other large country across the Atlantic has kind of landed with what many are looking at as a very interesting, flexible, agile framework. What's your assessment of the U.S. executive order, and how does it complement or maybe even conflict with what the EU is doing?
Yeah, thank you. I think looking at the US, we can see that they have went ahead and adopted a quasi-regulatory framework characterized by non-binding cooperation. In contrast, as I said earlier, Europe, as usual, has chosen a more binding regulatory approach. But in a way, this is what this city knows, right? And this is why lately I have called a number of times that we need to somehow rethink the way we legislate, particularly in the tech sphere, because this is not product packaging regulation. So political deals, as we know them, have to take a different approach when it takes to areas that are new to us, that are evolving at a fast pace. But this is for a separate discussion. Let me draw a little bit of a parallel between what happens. When it comes to the differences in these governance philosophies that are mentioned, I think we could see that exactly playing in front of our eyes. The different philosophies, but also the different technological priorities we have as nations, as countries, as European Union, and the US. And it, in a way, what happened over the past week, it reflects the current realities on the ground, which is that Congress will not pass any legislation anytime soon on AI. Hence, of course, the administration is choosing to act through an executive order. The vertical approach here that has been taken by the US, I think, is a good one. It allows us to focus on sector-specific and context-specific use cases. Now, the AI Act, as you all know, is horizontal in nature, and we could have a whole different discussion that we could save that for another day to discuss which approach and why. But even within the AI Act, we have worked, me particularly, the EPP group has worked very, very hard to make sure that we are targeting only the true high-risk cases that are out there, and having sector-specific guidelines, something that was important for us. I will not need to remind that there have been voices and calls for putting everything in the high-risk category, but thankfully we've moved far away from that point. But even though there are differences, and these are important differences, there are a lot of similarities. When it comes to foundational models, we can see that we are both focusing on the need to develop tools and benchmarking, provisions for watermarking generated content, measures for small developers, addressing algorithmic discrimination, and more. So you could see that in our both approaches, which is not little in my opinion. Of course, again, I'm going to this whole governance philosophy. It's very different. So we need to be cautious that the AI Act is not too burdensome, that after all, it gives some opportunity for innovation to thrive. Perhaps we'll need other tools and other measures to help build the ecosystem, to help support investment, to help attract talent, in order for us in 5 to 10 years to be able to have companies that are working on AI that is based on our democratic values here in Europe. But how we manage to develop and deploy AI has to be central also to the thinking of the process that is happening right now. It should not be just about the regulation. And I would like these two discussions happening at the same time. And I'll wrap up by saying, going to a small point I made in the beginning, why is this important? It's important for our competitiveness. We are faced with a struggling economy. It would be good if Europe's economy is strong. It will benefit also the US and that alliance of democracies that are trying to put the rules and set the rules when it comes to leading edge technologies such as AI, because after all, it has to be our alliance of democracies that is going to be working on this far-reaching global leadership on the topic. And it will be extremely important if we consider that while finalizing our discussions on the AI Act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. And I know you're time constrained, but that kind of sets up my question to Marjorie. And Marjorie, you're hearing there's some consensus going on between the EU and the US. G7 is trying to pull things together. These principles, I think, have been a compass for a lot of countries. But last June, you wrote that you didn't see this coming together. You saw a lot of disparate, uncoordinated efforts. What's your view now? And what's your thought about, should consensus stay within democracies, as Eva was just saying, or can we go beyond?
So I think Eva said it very eloquently. There's still extreme diversity in terms of the regulation approaches and texts that we have out there. And I think by and large, AI governance is still very much reflecting national legal tradition and specific policy regimes. And countries disagree on fundamental questions such as, should human rights be the cornerstone of AI governance? What's the role of big tech? Should we have vertical, sectoral, or horizontal whole society approaches? And these are big questions to disagree on. So I don't think we'll have full alignment of risk-based policies in the future. And maybe it's not desirable anyway. Maybe what we should look for is interoperability, as Jeremy mentioned. Maybe we will have some Brussels effect for the EU Act, but I would argue that at the implementation level and in practice, there will be many differences in terms of how countries deal with it. Now, at the international level, and I think that we're reaping the benefit of the OECD process, of the Hiroshima one, of what the UN is doing, and the G7 as well. And progressively, what I think will emerge is sort of the embodiment of AI governance at the global level. And I will assume that, you know, in the future, we'll probably have the equivalent of IPCC, so Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change for AI, which is something that was suggested by the private sector, as well as somehow is reflected in the Bletchley Declaration. I think there's something that we resolve to support internationally inclusive network of scientific research, which is very much linked to IPCC. However, we, as I say, at the international level, still many commonalities need to be found, and I would say that I have a wish list of 3 main elements I would like the international community to think a little bit longer and harder. And the first one is not going to be a surprise, and I think Jerry also mentioned it, is meaningful inclusion, and inclusion that is not just intergovernmental cooperation with the inclusion of big tech, but multi-stakeholder processes. And I think that was the main core criticism of the UK AI Safety Summit, is the potential overrepresentation of big tech and not sufficient inclusion of civil society and population affected by the main AI risk. And in the text, you don't have mention of multi-stakeholder. It says broad partnership, which is more regional than diversity of voices. The second element of my wish list is what I see emerging today is important technocratic scientific solution. Like IPCC is really driven by the scientific community, and that's important, but what we're facing is a socio-technical issue. It's as much as the technology as our way to interact with it, to use it, to perceive it. And therefore what you need, I believe, is more of a societal discussion and governance model that is sort of for society approach. And finally, and I think that, Andrew, you mentioned for me a key principle, which is agility. And yes, it's important to look at models of governance that work well today, but I would say we should be more ambitious. We're looking at a new field of international governance. How could we do better? And Andy, I may even quote you past work, but the OECD a few years ago published this really excellent report on anticipatory agile governance. And I would say this is AI is a field where we should really create anticipatory and agile model. It's more about the journey, as Jeremy says, static treaty that we may come up with. So that's really the ambition I would like us to set for ourselves.
Thank you, Marjorie. And cognizant, I want to try to get a question or two. Let me turn to Jeremy and then Yoichi. But Jeremy, you've heard a lot of different suggestions for new international organizations, a new IPCC, a new international avionics. I've heard people talking about CERN, the IAOA. Do you really think my problem with that? I think it's a great idea. The problem is, knowing full well, having worked at the OECD, that takes time to set those up. And do we have the time now? And how do we balance that conflict?
I think it's a great question, and it comes up a lot when you talk about the type of commitments companies will be making in the space. Who's going to check on those commitments, right? And you need to have some element of, I think, a monitoring mechanism there to make sure that we're all adhering to the things that we're on a consensus of and the rules that apply. But I think I would answer it a little bit differently. I think in the short to medium term, it's inevitable that there would be most likely a hybrid approach of sorts. But the goal should be that we want to get to a space where an AI system that is certified as safe in one jurisdiction is recognized as such in another. And I don't think you need necessarily to have in place the perfect body with all the statutes tomorrow in order to be able to get to that space. Standards will be developed. Those also sometimes take time, but they'll be important. We'll continue to see that emerge. So I can appreciate the concern. That's one that we absolutely recognize, and I think some of the multilateral and multi-stakeholder discussions that have already taken place reflect just where there's a lot of benefit to that. Whether you come up with the perfect new body or existing body within the next 3 to 6 months, it's recognized the challenge there. But I think as long as the goal is to get to a space, and you can do this even in some of the domestic discussions that are happening now, to get to that space where an AI system that's been certified as safe in one jurisdiction is recognized as such in another, that's really the end goal. You can have differences at national level along the way, but if there is that consensus on the opportunities, there's the consensus on the risk-based approach, and even a consensus on some of the most significant harms, I would like to think that the different types of international discussions that are already underway, particularly in a standard space, will help get you there before you find the right answer to your question about which body is going to be best suited.
No, I think that's excellent. It sets up the next panel on standards, which I think are not as well appreciated in the process. They're part of the soft law, hard law nexus. Yoichi, thank you for staying up late. I want to turn to you just at the end here, but Just quickly, you alluded to in your earlier comments the need to take it beyond the G7 to a more global community. What are your ideas on how to do that?
Yeah, actually, we have started inviting some partner countries beyond the G7 to join the discussion at the Hiroshima process. And we are also planning to strengthen our collaboration with OECD and probably GPay to discuss how we could share our guiding principles and common code of conduct. And also to explore more technical solutions to address some risks and vulnerabilities brought by generative AI and foundation models. So we are already in play, but we don't think we are heading for setting up a new organization, but we will pursue a more flexible and agile structure for collaboration. And we, of course, try to be inclusive. So we have started a consultation with various stakeholders through a kind of public consultation or other ways, approaches. And it was very much impressive for me to see, EU was the first member when we decided to start multi-stakeholder consultation on our guiding principles. So I think having differences in approaches in our policy making, G7 members and also the partners beyond share the same the democratic values and also other fundamental disciplines that would guide us, I believe, to a harmonized and interoperable global AI governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yoichi. And so we just have a few minutes left. I want to try to squeeze in a question from the audience here and one from online. And the online questions aren't coming too quickly, except for one that takes the really long view. And wow, this guy has got the long view back to the Clipper chips, which no one in the audience will remember except me. But he's asking, how can we learn from past mistakes on things that haven't gone right to get it closer to reality this time? And I see there's a question in the audience as well. I'm going to pull an OECD trick, ask you to make your question as well, and then let the panelists very quickly answer either of these two.
Good afternoon.
Quickly, please.
Yes, it's Mark Scott here from Politico. One for Yoichi from regarding the G7 process. Could you explain what happens next? Your presidency is coming to an end. The Italians are taking over. What do you expect to happen, particularly in consultation with the OECD, the G20, and also what's going on now in Brussels and the US in terms of their action? Thank you.
Great question. So permit me, I'm going to ask Yoichi to answer first, and then Jeremy or Marjorie for whatever question you like. Yoichi, if you keep it short, we're down about 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this question. Actually, we are now discussing with other members, in particular Italy, how we could continue the initiative, because we have agreed on guiding principles and code of conduct for developers, and we are now starting to discuss the guiding principles with other AI actors, including end users and the AI service providers. And then we need to implement those principles into actions, and also we need to promote other project-based activities in collaboration with OECD and other international organizations. So Japanese presidency will end up at the end of the year, but G7 initiative should continue, and Actually, Japan is taking the presidency of Ministerial Council at OECD next year, because next year is 60th anniversary for Japan as member of OECD. So we have a lot of chance to continue our work together with other international organizations and other stakeholders, other member countries, and then at the end, we hope we could have a kind of inclusive platform to discuss AI governance. And our model is Internet Governance Forum, which is not perfect, of course, but which can be one of the best forums to be inclusive and global and flexible. So that is our idea at this moment, and we are of course, keep improving our idea by discussing with all stakeholders across the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yoichi. Marjorie, Jeremy?
On avoiding mistakes of the past, I think that with a very fast evolving technology such as AI, it will be difficult to avoid all mistakes. But I think that going back to the notion of anticipatory agile governance, if we manage to contain the mistake, to test it and test the different models that we think of for governance, we can at least avoid too big consequences of our future mistakes.
And I think it's a great question. I think it's actually a very important question because you can look at it from a couple of angles. One, it reminds me of some of the excitement we had around social media and the like, and just all of the benefits that would bring. You think back to the Arab Spring and the likes. I think several years later, there were other things that happened that made people much, much more concerned, right? And was that a failure of rules, what have you? You can still have that discussion, but we have an opportunity to learn from mistakes, both in terms of risks we want to avoid and mitigate, absolutely. But I think we also have to worry about the mistakes of looking at only the risks and losing out on some of the benefits that are even more important, which I think the international consensus that does exist, which is good news, is that this is going to be a technology powering important economic growth of the future. I think it's much different than other things that have emerged and memes, if you will. There's always a new hot technology, but this is so foundational that we think it's going to power economic growth and have geopolitical implications for the future. So we also want to be careful that we're learning from past mistakes about making sure that we have the right frameworks in place that strike that balance between the risks that we all agree on, but allow for the responsible innovation that is going to be so important.
That's a great way to end this session. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the panel, particularly Yoichi coming from Japan.
Another great panel. Thank you so much to Andrew and to all his panelists there, Jeremy, Marjorie, Ava Meidel, of course, who had to leave a little bit earlier, and Luigi for the Japanese perspective. And thank you so much for your attention. Ladies and gentlemen, there's just 2 more panels to go. A lot of food of thought this morning, and then it'll be time for lunch. But now it is time, as Andrew said, to talk about standards. I feel like as the morning continues, we're getting deeper and deeper into the issues, and it's great to have the time to go thorough. So now it's time to introduce the next moderator, Cameron Carey, the Distinguished Visiting Fellow from the Brookings Institution that you already met this morning. You can go ahead perhaps and introduce your guests with a little bit more details, but I'll just briefly introduce Maeve Rutte from the European Commission, from the DG Internal Market, Elham Tabassi, and Wael William Diab. Do we have Wael William Diab as well? Online. Okay, over to you.
Good, I do see Wael. So Andrea Renda kicked us off today by saying that AI has made standards interesting. I am excited to be here with rock stars in the AI standardization field. We have seen that in recent years, all the major players in AI, China, the EU, the US, have all put out standardization strategies on AI and emerging technologies, and really looking at standards from a strategic standpoint. And standards are part of the White House order. They are in the G7 plans, work plans. There's a lot of focus on this. So it's wonderful to have the expertise that we have. We will delve in a little bit more on the substance of AI standardization, but just to introduce the topic and to level set a little bit, let me ask each of you to just kind of introduce yourselves and your role. So let me start, bring William Diab into the conversation. He leads the ISO IEC JTC 21, and this is one of the complications of standards. There's lots of acronyms, lots of numbers, and lots of process. But can you talk to us a little bit about what ISO is, what ISO IEC JTC 21 is, and your role as the chair of that group?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
We sure can.
Perfect. Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity. I think, as was mentioned, I chair the joint committee between ISO and IEC on artificial intelligence. And just to let you know a little bit about it, so ISO and IEC work on international standards under a system of one country, one vote. We currently have 60 countries that actively participate in our committee, of which 33% are considered developing countries. So that reflects both, countries that are more predominantly producing, and as well as some that are looking to use. And we produce horizontal standards. We have over 60 different liaison relationships, internal and external. And so just picking up from the last panel, one of the reasons standards is very important is it's part of the solution. It's part of really how we can connect some of these technical requirements to other non-technical requirements, for example, like regulatory frameworks coming out around the world. In terms of our work, we actually produce horizontal standards. We have 5 direct working groups that cover everything from foundational standards. So we have, for instance, ISO IEC 22989, which is on terminology, and that's freely available for everyone. We are also working on a management system standard that will enable certification of AI systems. But our focus areas are quite diverse. So beyond that, we look at the data ecosystem, we look at trustworthiness, we look at the computational ecosystem, as well as the applications and use cases. And one of the things that we've seen happen, and being part of the ISO and IEC families, is that the application of AI in terms of verticals and domains, as was touched on in the last panel, is becoming increasingly important. So we work very closely with other IEC and ISO committees building their roadmaps for AI. In fact, we have 4 joint working groups with various committees under IEC, ISO, and JTC1. So I think it's a very exciting time. It's also, in terms of standards, perhaps not as often talked about, but in the world of AI, where people are looking for responsible adoption and trying to see the societal benefits that can come out of AI if it's done responsibly, standards are a key part of that solution.
Great. Well, we'll get to explore that a little bit more. But Maeva Ruta, let me turn to you. You are Deputy Director General at DG GROW here in Brussels. But you also have the role of standards coordinator for the European Union. I mentioned the EU strategy. That's a position that was created by that. Tell us about that role, what it envisions, and particularly it's your role in the implementation of the AI Act.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about an exciting topic of standards. And let me make sure that people indeed in the audience stay all awake. In my role in the department in the Commission responsible for industry policy, internal market or single market, and small business policy, standards is actually one of these tools that we have to make things work. You may know that single market is now 30 years old. And in fact, during these 30 years, standards have been one of the way how we have made the single market work. And what do I mean by that? The way how we legislate in Europe is that many of our laws are written, let's say, as stating the main principles. And then you take the standards which set these principles in a much more concrete, technical, implementable level. And these standards then, of course, if they are harmonized standards which apply throughout all our member states, these will then help the companies to get this conformity with EU law when they follow the standards. And over the 30 years, we have developed quite a stock of standards. We have something like 3,600 harmonized standards which are implementing the EU law and which save costs to our manufacturers, which help the goods and services to move within European Union, and of course also which indeed make sure that the products, services come with the quality and the safety that is foreseen in our legislation. It's important to mention something that people may not know. And this came, I think, very much up already in the two previous panels, namely the need for, particularly for AI type of technologies, to be tackled with this whole society approach when we talk about setting norms or setting standards. And in fact, in Europe, this is how we do standards. Our standardization is very much bottom-up. We actually, as European Union, we give certain subsidies to these voices which otherwise would maybe not be so much heard. So we are making sure that we have our smaller businesses represented in the technical committees which are drafting standards. We also make sure we have consumers represented, that we indeed involve the various civil society representatives in our standardization system. And by this inclusive bottom-up approach, we do hope that also when we talk about important areas such as AI, we would also not only have the expectations and kind of common rules created, but we also make sure that really the final take-up of these technologies would be faster because there are agreed principles that are underpinning it. So concretely on the AI Act, this has been already presented, I think, in the previous panels to a certain extent. So let me maybe mention that the way we see it currently, and you are aware that our AI Act is still in negotiations, so it's in the so-called trialogues where the Parliament and Council discuss it, and Commission is there as well. So the way we currently see it is actually a bit unusual for standard making practice. We have been very much anticipating the need to have standards for AI, and we have been already proactively working with researchers and working with various stakeholders to develop the capacity to really get this standard work ahead, even though our legislation is still in negotiations. And of course, the way how it will work is that if the legislation sets certain criteria, for example, trustworthiness, then of course the standards would then need to go down into the level of implementability. What do you mean by trustworthiness? Is it about data quality? Is it about robustness of the system? Maybe it is about cybersecurity. So all these elements will need to be defined more concretely in the standards. And we as European Commission, we have given out so-called standardization request, which means that we as Commission, we request European standardization organizations to create these technical committees and start looking into what it takes to implement the future AI Act. And this work is ongoing. We have our Sensenelec standardization organization working through their technical committees. And we also very actively participate actually in the international level work, and I'm happy to see our colleagues here from ISO, IEC, because this is very much the level where the work currently happens, and our European standard setters or standard designers are very much part of the story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Elham Tabasi, your agency has the word standards in its name, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And you are Associate Director for Emerging Technologies there. What is NIST's role in standards? And what are you doing with respect to emerging technologies, including AI?
Thank you so very much, Cam, and organizers for including me in this important conversations at this important time. Again, we are, as it was mentioned last week, and the series of the AI developments makes it an extremely interesting time for AI. NIST, or National Institute of Standards and Technology, is a federal agency under Department of Commerce. It's a non-regulatory agency. We have a very broad portfolio of research, doing anything from building the most accurate atomic clock to cybersecurity and AI and modeling the behavior of the wildfire, all these things. But also, most importantly, a long-lasting reputation of cultivating trust in technology. And we do that by advancing measurement science, by participating in development of the standards and measurement science that make technology more robust, more reliable, more secure, more private, in other words, more trustworthy. And that's exactly what we are doing in the space of AI. Directed by a congressional mandate in January, NIST released the AI Risk Management Framework. It's a voluntary framework for managing the risk of AI systems across the different life cycle of the AI in a structured, flexible, and measurable way. Flexible to allow for innovation to happen and be adopted and be basically future-proof. Structured in terms of it provides, particularly the first part of the AI RMF, provides a interoperable lexicon. And we heard it in earlier panels, the importance of having clear understanding of terms and terminologies, and as maybe you mentioned, understanding what we mean by trustworthy, what constitutes trust. And then the third attribute of measurable, that's really important for us as a measurement agency, because if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. The AI RMF, as its name suggests, is a risk-based approach, but it's also a rights-based approach, putting the protection of the people and planet in the heart of that. It was developed in an open, transparent, collaborative process involving a diversity of thoughts and backgrounds, from the experts that building the technology, mathematicians, statisticians, computer scientists, engineers, but also the community that study the impact of the technology, psychologists, sociologists, cognitive scientists, all of them. Another important attribute of the AI RMF is that it takes a socio-technical approach, because as it was mentioned several times today, AI systems are more than just data, compute, and algorithm. They are a complex interactions of data, compute, and algorithm with the environment, with the conditions that are being used, with the human that operates it, the human that's used it, and all of the individuals and society that's being impacted by AI system. Since the release of the AI RMF, we released a companion playbook to provide more information about how to actually operationalize AI RMF. We put a crosswalk to bring semantic alignment between AI RMF and many other good work that has been done. We put out a AI Resource Center to be a one-stop shop of information about AI. So AI RMF companion playbook, but also information such as a glossary for AI risk and AI risk management. And we are going to add a standard tracker to that. And then lastly, in June, we launched a generative AI public working group with the goal of developing a cross-sectoral profile of AI RMF for managing the risk of generative AI. Right now, we are working on 4 sets of guidelines: guidelines for pre-deployment assessment, guidelines for content provenance, guidelines for incident disclosure, and guidelines for governance of the AI, generative AI systems.
So let me put a question to everyone on the panel, which really, I think, comes out of some of the earlier discussions today. And I guess I'd put it this way, is how is AI standardization, how are AI standards different from seatbelts or avionics? Who wants to? You look poised.
I can maybe start and then colleagues will continue. Well, let me first say that there are certainly some elements that are very similar. We certainly want the standards to be developed in this inclusive way. We want to, of course, follow the good practices which are recognized by WTO on how do you do standards. That these need to be transparent processes. There are principles that need to be followed also for AI. But there are then, I think, some essential changes or differences as well, starting from the point that, as many already have said in the previous panels, this is not simply a technical issue. We are very much talking about socio-technical, if you wish, technologies. That is already posing a very important challenge to try and translate this, let's say, ethical expectations and fundamental rights expectations into a technical language of standards, which should be implementable and should be also measurable. So this is, I think, a big really difference and a very important challenge for the standard makers. The second challenge that comes now with the AI, and I would say actually more broadly actually with the Internet of Things, has to do with the fact that these are systems which are designed to learn and change their behavior and maybe become better or become more effective or whatever they might be, which for us means that normally when we look at the product coming to EU market, we test the safety and performance when it is placed to the market or before it is placed to the market. But now with the AI type products and services, we need to be able to follow it through the lifetime of this product and make sure that also in the next year or years to come, it is still compliant and is not turning against the original, let's say, design or the safety rules that have been there in the beginning. So this evolvement, this adjustment is something that needs to be looked at and certainly also built into our standard setting logic, and this is not making things easier. And then the third element that I think is also recognized already, but we are still struggling a bit with it, is really the speed of this AI development and the breadth of it. It really covers so many different areas that also for the technical expertise to be brought into standardization process. This is already quite a challenge to get all these people who understand the AI, but also have the technical expertise in whatever area we're talking about. I mean, from languages to all kinds of machinery. So this is really, I would say, a really tremendous challenge for the standardization bodies. And we are bravely going for it.
Elham, Wael, do you want to come in on that?
Sure, I'll build up on what you said. So in addition to the speed and scale of this and socio-technical nature of that, there's also that we don't have the right scientific underpinning for how to, for example, measure many of these socio-technical characteristics. So we have to build that knowledge to be able to build standards that, as you said, are clear and implementable. And we are doing it all, but at the same time. And going back to the breadth of the application of the AI that you mentioned, we need both sets of standards. Wael talked about horizontal standards that's kind of cover the, again, terminology and everything that's common across the different applications of the AI. We want, for example, bias or interpretability have the same meaning if we are using it or measuring it for healthcare, application of AI in healthcare versus application of AI in financial sector. But we also need vertical standards that takes these topics and get them more slanted, more tailored, more specific to the particular use case. And I think that's also makes it a bit more difficult, more expanding in development of standards.
Yeah. So just one follow-up question, Elham. How do you develop the scientific knowledge that's needed to do the standardization? Where do you see the gaps?
I think the biggest gap, again, goes back to the metrology and measurement. Again, for us, an agency with more than 100 years of experience in evaluating technology, I like to say that we perfected the art and science of technology evaluations when we bring systems and models into the lab, divorced from their context of use, run the test data and analyze that. Those type of testing is not going to be sufficient for AI because of the socio-technical nature. They ought to be measured in their context of use, where the interaction with the human and environment is happening. And that's a rather new challenge for the whole community. And how we are doing it is just something that NIST is, I think, is our strength on bringing the community together and bring all of the minds and bright minds across the globe together to focus the energy and the knowledge in advancing those.
Well, how are you dealing with these issues
Yeah,
on
I
the
mean,
ground?
it's a great question. I think, I agree with everything that the other speakers have said. Maybe a couple of things I would add is, first of all, we're not starting from scratch. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of AI that is IT. And for that, there's a lot of ISO IEC standards that are being used and deployed today. And what we do on the horizontal side is we look at, the areas where AI is different, whether it's the learning or the measurement or a lot of the things that have already been mentioned. And we either extend existing standards or build new ones. A good example of where we have done that is with our management system standards. So we leveraged an approach, if you're familiar with ISO 9001 or ISO IEC 27001 for cybersecurity, and we're doing something similar with our management system standard on 42001 to really address and enable certification and get a higher level of assurance. I also think, part of this is how you work with verticals. And one of the changes that we've seen over the last couple of years is really trying to work as early as we can with as many groups within ISO and IEC that we can, because they have the domain expertise there. So, for example, we're working on a AI-enabled health informatics. More recently, we just started a new joint working group to look at functional safety and AI systems. So this is in application domains where functional safety is very important. We're in the process of standing up a new joint working group on natural language processing systems. So we're continuing to do that. I think another difference to me also is, maybe now for those of us that have been talking AI for the past few years, we take it for granted, but dealing with things like ethics very early on in the development process of standards is quite different than how we've approached it in the past. And it's really, you find that it's integrated into the entire fabric of our portfolio. And so that piece of it, thinking about those questions as you are developing the technical standards up front is important. And I think the last piece I would say, in terms of, because I do think being reactive, people typically look at standards as being a slow process. And while, it does take time to produce a high quality standard, we are trying to be very reactive. And in order to do that, whether it's things like outreach or really building out the whole ecosystem and working with as many partners as we can across the ecosystem is another tool in our set, so to speak, to allow us to not only execute quicker, but also identify what some of the emerging trends and requirements are. So sometimes we'll work with organizations that may not necessarily be focused on the technical side of AI standardization, but maybe looking at it from a policy point of view, and they may bring out new requirements that we were not aware of, and that helps us initiate new projects.
Great, thank you. So I saw a question over here in the room, right there. Let's take that. And Carolina, maybe you take the opportunity to pass me iPad for the online questions.
I think we should talk also about the limitation of standards. We cannot standardize ethics, for example. That's something which will be very difficult to measure. You talked a lot about how to transform some of the rules or principles into rules that developers can adopt and that sort of thing. That's a technical aspect. But on the social aspect, because when we want to provide a standard, that means also that we should provide a way for people, and every people, to verify by themselves. And in fact, a standard should be verified by some people who are not specialists. So the social aspect is very, very difficult. And we should recognize also that probably for ethics, we will get a lot of problems to standardize those.
Yeah.
Great point. If I can just make a quick point. I think we can just start by increasing the diversity of the participation in development of the standard. Right now, it's technical folks and people that have experience in development of the standards. Let's bring more eyes, civil society and others into the process.
Yeah.
Maybe just very quickly, I think there are maybe 2 points to mention in this regard. I'm fully with you also that standards, of course, need to have the way of bringing the various stakeholders, various civil society representatives in the process, and you are aware in Europe this is what we do. But maybe what is interesting to mention in this regard is that we have also now, with our new standardization strategy, introduced a way of getting the civil society, let's say, insights to the very highest level of our standardization policy design and drafting. We have created something we call high-level forum for standardization. And that is where, at our commissioner level, we are meeting with civil society, with member states and standardization organizations, as well as industry. It's kind of a platform where such concerns can be already raised. And I think it's essential that it's not only happening in technical committees, but we take it at a more closer to political level as well. And the other element is that, of course, some of these questions that you touch upon, of course, need to be already in the law itself. So in case of Europe, I mean, the AI Act already should be, the base of the later standardization. So standards can only do their part, but where we need the public mandate, of course, a public mandate should come with the legislation, regulation itself as well.
Yeah, I would just add one thing on the ethics component. I think that the person that asked the question is right. Ethics is not a very easy thing to deal with. However, it's not impossible. And we've done quite a bit of work from the inception of the committee. I'll give a small example. Typically, when technical committees talk to each other, especially if you're working with a vertical, we talk about what the use case looks like. One of the innovations that we have done is to ask when we create these use cases, what are your ethical concerns? And that can come in stated within the use case. We then would translate that into what technical requirements that would translate into. So a lot of the work that supports the ethics is across the whole portfolio, and especially in areas like trustworthiness. So I agree, it certainly is not the easiest topic to deal with, but it doesn't mean that standards are not addressing that. And I'd be happy to follow up with the speaker offline if they're interested to learn more about the program of work in 42 and how we're dealing with that question.
Great. So Andrea Renda said early, in response to standards having become interesting, quoted one of our participants saying, maybe we need to make standards boring again. And I think that reflects a concern about sort of the increased geostrategic lens that's being put on standards. You mentioned that the EU takes a bottoms-up approach. That's very much what Alex described. It's sort of part of the NIST DNA. Is there a risk that as governments become increasingly involved, as the Commission comes out with standardization requests, potentially common specifications, that we end up with top-down standards development. And how do we protect against that while energizing standards, while increasing participation, as you've talked about?
Should I start?
By all means.
Very good question, and let me perhaps begin from the EU side. I think already previous panels also pointed out that although we are all making efforts to try and have kind of a global governance and view on AI, we cannot close our eyes to the point that there are important differences in the way we understand matters, in the way we understand what are public interest or personal privacy matters and so on. So we as EU, we work very closely, as I already said, with international, or we work at the international level with the ISO IEC in the panel that is, several actually working groups that are represented here in the panel as well. And our thinking is that wherever possible, we would take the international standards and use them as European harmonized standards. But in case if there would be significant, let's say, elements which we cannot translate or transpose to European circumstances because our ethical expectations are different, or there are maybe contradictions or with our EU AI Act, for example, then the ways how we will treat it is we would look at a way how, let's say, grave or significant the change of difference is. We can then either apply a so-called interpretation of international standard, which would still allow this to be used, or we would draft for this particular element our own EU standards. So this is a normal way. And Commission is not interested in starting to draft these technical specifications ourselves. These would be only in some sort of very exceptional cases where for some reason or another the standardization organizations would not come with a solution. But I would say the main way is the standardization organizations delivering on their mandate. But essentially is also the international collaboration. And between EU and US, we have this Technology and Trade Council. Some of you might know about it. There is actually a working group specifically on standardization because we want to be well aligned. And we also have a regular dialogue actually with China on regulatory matters. And again, also that standardization is one of the matters. So we are working at the broader policy level as well as international standard setting bodies to make sure really that things are well aligned. And maybe if I can finish with one call to people in the room and online, we really need more experts in our standardization technical committees in Europe as well as in the international technical groups. So please, 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 could you yourselves or so your companies or organizations find ways of sending your experts to these important working groups, because that is how the new future through standards is going to be shaped.
So, well, let me ask you to come in and then Ella, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think actually something Ilham said earlier is, you know, the more stakeholders and the more views is a good thing. And certainly, you know, I think from, you know, what I've seen in our committee, having more views, and even if it, you know, whether it's coming from industry or private or public sector, has been quite helpful in making sure that our standards are more robust and horizontal. In the case of working with the with Europe, ISO and IEC have agreements that allow for some of these standards to be adopted. The ISO one is called the Vienna Agreement, and the IEC one is called the Frankfurt Agreement. But more broadly, I think I would just kind of step back and say that this is also part of the normal process where, you know, at least on the international side of the standards work, you know, we have one country, one vote, but those countries are made up of stakeholders that are quite diverse. Again, both public, private sector, academia, and we are seeing more and more people, experts themselves of very diverse backgrounds. When I started my work in IT standards 20 years ago, it was predominantly engineers and marketeers. Today, we see people with legal backgrounds, with academic backgrounds, with social backgrounds. So I think that's very encouraging. And I think it's also something that is hopefully becomes more of a trend as technology becomes more integrated into our lives. I think this is something that's very good and helpful in the long run.
I want to second and third, I'm always ask and call to please engage, please involve. And make two quick points. Number one is that, Cam, you started by saying that standard is our middle name, but we are not a standard development organizations. We are, and there's a lot of really good policies and laws in the US that why government should not develop standards, but facilitate development of the standards by private sector. And then lastly say that good standards are clear and implementable, but also science-based and empirically backed. That's why we need the standards to be bottom-up. That's why we need the engagement with the experts. Experts now, as we talked, gets a very diverse meaning, from the technical to broader than, bringing social and cognitive scientists all in the mix to develop standards that are technically robust, scientifically valid, clear and implementable, because at a high level when government come up with policy and regulations, they don't get into what we mean by, for example, they can say that AI must be safe, but the nitty-gritty of what safety is, how safety is defined, how to ensure and assure that the systems is safe, is rely on the good standards.
Well, thank you. It's a complicated subject. I hope we've scratched a little bit of the surface of it today and explained a little bit about the focus on standards and the ways that standards may sort of provide an architecture for interoperability. You talked about measurement and processes, and that, I think, is why there is a lot of the interest in standards. So thank you for being here today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
And thank you. A very complex topic, but I feel that I learned a lot. Thanks to the eloquent panelists. And of course, wonderfully moderated there by Cameron. So thank you so much for that. Just 20 minutes to go before we gather for lunch downstairs here in the building. As Joshua said earlier, he would be hosting a panel right up here about China, whether China is a foe or a friend in the field of artificial intelligence. So Joshua, I would like to invite you up here on stage. You'll be joined as well by Rebecca Arcasati, a lead analyst with the Mercator Institute for China Studies. And you'll be joined virtually by Matt Sheehan. He's a fellow at the Asia program at Carnegie. So over to you. Thank you so much, Matt.
Great, thank you. And we are the panel standing between you and lunch after a long morning. And we have 20 minutes to discuss a very, very substantive topic. So there's a lot of pressure to put as much as we can into this in the shortest period of time. And so I'm just going to launch straight into a conversation with really two of the foremost experts, I think, thinking about developments in China around AI policy and a whole range of digital issues. So let me just start out with a level-setting question. Tell me, what is China doing at the moment in terms of domestic AI regulation? Matt, why don't we start with you online?
Sure thing. So right now, domestically on AI governance, I'd say China is at a crossroads. They've been working on this and developing sort of practical binding regulations for longer than most countries, or at least they've been implementing them for longer than most countries. And they've been following one path in the sort of 2020 to 2023 period. And right now we're at a crossroads. So what does that path look like so far? It's been about developing targeted, binding, but also iterative regulations. So they first rolled out a regulation on recommendation algorithms. Then they rolled out one on deep synthesis, which is essentially a Chinese word for generative AI before we started talking about generative AI. And then shortly after that, they rolled out a secondary regulation that is explicitly targeting generative AI. So you have these three targeted regulations that were rolled out in the span of about 2 years' time. that set actual, meaningful binding limitations on specific applications of the technology, but don't try to throw out sort of an umbrella regulation on the entire technology. These have all been initially motivated by concerns over online content. They were all developed by the Cyberspace Administration of China, which is essentially China's online censorship regulator. And so they all have that focus, recommendation algorithms. They wanted to make sure that these weren't recommending content or disseminating content that the government didn't like. And Deep Synthesis Generative AI was driven by concerns about deepfakes initially, and then about chatbot services later on. So you've got these targeted binding regulations, but they're sort of bound together by some more interesting technical tools or regulatory tools. For example, what they call their algorithm registry, which is a form of sort of standardized disclosure around what data sets or algorithms trained on, and then the ability to sort of force AI developers to run some tests. It's not totally different from the kind of ideas we heard about in terms of a standard setting organization. And the kind of requirements you can place on AI systems. So that's been the model so far. And right now I'd say we're at a crossroads because China is shifting its focus potentially from these targeted regulations to producing one national AI law. That's something that they put on the agenda. The State Council, sort of China's cabinet, put on the agenda earlier this year. Right now, there's some back and forth about whether China actually needs a national AI law or they can stick to these targeted regulations. So that's kind of one crossroads we're at. Do they stick to this road they're on, or do they try to essentially level up and create their own national AI law? And then there's the question about China's international engagement. Everything so far has been quite domestically focused. It's been driven by domestic concerns. It's been led by a regulator, the Cyberspace Administration of China, that's very focused on domestic online content. And that's been true thus far, but at the moment with China's Global AI Governance Initiative, with it engaging at the UK AI Summit, and with different parts of the Chinese bureaucracy getting activated, we're seeing a lot of uncertainty about where they go from here. Do they continue with their domestic regulations kind of being the basis on which they engage internationally? Or do they send other parts of the government? Do they activate other parts of the bureaucracy to engage with international AI governance? And maybe there I'd hand it over to Rebecca.
Matt, thanks. That's a very comprehensive, I think, overlay of what China's doing. Rebecca, you're doing a lot of work around looking at what the EU is doing and what China's doing in terms of AI governance. Do you want to sort of pick up on where Matt led off and provide a little bit of a sense of where China's heading that is sort of familiar and parallels some of the developments here in the EU, and where you see some of the key differences are?
Absolutely. Thank you, and thanks for having me. So I think Matt already provided an excellent context and summary of what China's doing domestically. I think it's important to realize that in the West, also here in Europe, we're finally moving from the question of whether China even thinks about ethics and governance questions with regard to AI to how exactly China is governing this technology. And it's quite important to really pay close attention to these developments in China. We tend to think that information controls are the only driver of China's AI regulation. As Matt mentioned, the Cyberspace Administration of China has been really in the driver's seat in terms of developing regulations. However, we've also seen other societal concerns being channeled into government regulation in China, ranging from privacy to consumer rights, even workers' rights. So concern that are familiar to also regulators here in Europe. The Chinese government is working also quite closely with a community that's comprised of different stakeholders. So it's important to realize that we're not dealing with a monolithic entity. Chinese AI governance is a space where academics, engineers, companies come together really to shape standards and regulations. They're going about it by a trial and error. I think some of these ambitious regulations that Matt already mentioned are very experimental, very new. For example, their mechanism for algorithmic auditing, that's very much an experiment. I think it's going to be really important for European actors, also for other Western actors, to really understand maybe the do's and don'ts, to really draw lessons from those efforts. One thing I will also note is that I think we're seeing government regulation nudging AI R&D in China in a certain direction. And one interesting example is generative AI, where the government is basically saying to technology companies, you know, chatbots, be really careful about those. These are, you know, very specific data requirements, content moderation requirements that you need to abide by, because obviously the government is concerned about anything that might mobilize public opinion online. However, companies are very much encouraged to apply generative AI in industry verticals, such as healthcare or manufacturing. And this is very much because I think the government has realized the potential of AI as a general purpose technology that will be really relevant for China's economic upgrading and the transformation of its society.
That's very helpful, and I think this notion of the variety of regulators involved in this space, CAC clearly central, but others playing a role in different contexts, and the domestic sort of multi-stakeholder environment that is building the regulatory approach is also, you know, familiar, right? And in terms of how we are developing similar approaches here in Europe and the US and certainly elsewhere. Just moving from what's happening domestically a little bit more into the international space, how is China thinking about engaging on the AI policy space broadly? So this can be the regulation piece, but also some of the other issues we spoke about previously, whether it's around the compute, the data, talent and so forth outside of China globally. What's its approach so far? How would you describe that, Matt?
They've got a few sort of initiatives going on this front, and I think they essentially haven't sort of settled on a model of international engagement, maybe partly because they don't know exactly what they want out of international engagement at this point in time. So maybe the two or three major things that have happened so far is China released its Global AI Governance Initiative in October. This was announced by President Xi at the Belt and Road Forum. And it was essentially a set of principles, although I'd say maybe significantly more detailed than principles, China's approach to AI governance that it hopes to internationalize or promote. This, you know, a lot of overlap with other sets of international principles, the normal things on trustworthy, fair, all that kind of stuff. I'd say where it differs from other international approaches is that it put a heavy emphasis on countries in the developing world, and it put a heavy emphasis on equity of access. And I'd say both of these things, there's an underlying reality there. There's a real concern that countries in the developing world are going to be left out of the global AI governance conversation. And there are major issues with, you know, equitable access to powerful AI systems and models outside of, you know, the sort of usual suspects of the developed world or of leading AI countries. So China's touching on some very real concerns, but I think there's also some very real geopolitical motivations behind that. With the equity of access piece of it, they put a heavy emphasis on sort of not creating groups based on ideological stances, not using sort of supply chains and access to critical components as a way to limit other countries' access to AI. That's using the global conversation on sort of equity and then sort of pulling it into the specific Chinese concerns of getting cut off from semiconductors by the United States. China's also trying to position itself as something of a spokesperson for, or a leader or an advocate for countries in the developing world, saying, you know, we're the major power that is kind of closest to this group, and we're going to make sure that their voices are heard. So those are the kind of geopolitical interests that I think are in many ways shaping the Global AI Governance Initiative, along with the normal things that make any country want to engage in global AI governance. You want to be part of the conversation. You don't want terms dictated by other countries, and you have genuine values and ideas you want to advance. So that's one aspect of it, and that piece has actually been led by the Cyberspace Administration of China. They were the authors of the sort of main authors of the initiative, which is a bit interesting that they'd be behind that. Then you have the Ministry of Science and Technology, which is what went to the UK AI Summit. They're not the dominant player domestically, but they have been chosen as the organization to engage on at least sort of frontier AI risks at the UK Summit. And I think there's some bureaucratic competition behind the scenes between the Ministry of Science and Technology and CAC over which of these countries is going to lead on that. I think it was very important that China went to the UK AI Summit. It was very symbolically meaningful. I don't think it creates a lot of new binding domestic constraints. It's not going to reshape how China develops AI domestically, but it's a signal and it's a meaningful on that front. And then I guess the last component is in the Global AI Governance Initiative and in other forums, China has repeatedly said that it thinks the UN should be the central body for international AI governance, or it should be the central forum for international AI governance. This reflects China overall likes the UN. It's a very sort of sovereignty-based organization, and China likes sovereignty. And it likes its voice at the UN. It likes to be on the Security Council, and it just thinks that UN has more legitimacy in these areas. So China has pushed that, and two Chinese AI policy scholars have recently been named to the UN's high-level AI advisory group, one named Zheng Yi and one named Zhangling Han, both of whom are sort of leading scholars in shaping China's AI governance domestically. So we don't know exactly how that's going to play out. I think no one has a clear sense of exactly what role the UN is going to play, but it's worth noting that China's placed an emphasis on that area. So you kind of have these three things going: a global AI governance initiative that is pushed by the CAC and has these sort of geopolitical components to it. You have China engaging at the UK AI Summit through the Ministry of Science and Technology. And then you have China's engagement at the UN level, which I think is very open-ended at this point, but could turn out to be quite important.
That's a fascinating setup, and of course we've got a keynote by the UN Special Rapporteur after lunch, so we'll hear a lot more about where the UN is at on global governance for AI. When you sit in Washington, you certainly get a view of the world that there's going to be a global governance sort of a process that will be focused on like-minded countries, including the EU, of course, and China's on the other side of that governance divide, and there is a strong sense that there is no space for a lot of cooperation, maybe in the defense kind of space a little. I'm curious, how do you see that sitting here? How do you see engagement with China on global governance issues, international cooperation with China from an EU perspective, or broaden that out if you wish?
I think it's important to realize that China's engagement with international global AI governance conversations is very much taking place on two levels. You have the day-to-day participation of Chinese engineers, Chinese companies in prominent international standard-setting bodies, right? Chinese companies play a huge role in global R&D communities for AI. So through that participation, we're already seeing China participating along with their colleagues from Europe, from the US and other countries. That level takes place, it coexists with what Matt already described, which is this effort by official China, this Chinese government outreach, to really promote its domestic approach a bit more internationally. And there, I think it's quite clear that China wants to have a seat at the table. They've been trying to do so for a few years. They've also signed onto important international, albeit non-binding commitments. For example, China signed onto the G20 principles. It signed onto the UNESCO recommendations on the ethics of AI. China has also been very active within the UN, UNESCO, and other agencies to cooperate on specific applications of AI, such as AI in education or healthcare. So that is happening. On top of that, we saw the CAC initiative that was announced after the BRI summit. And I think the intent of that document was also quite clearly to say, at a time when the United States is imposing constraints on China's access to AI-relevant technology, specifically high-end semiconductor technology, China is a responsible player. China wants to present itself as a responsible and constructive player. The challenge here, with a view to global engagement, I think, is the fact that China's outreach is tied to a broader agenda, which I think we need to recognize while engaging with Chinese government actors. China is trying to reshape global norms. It is trying to legitimize its own political as well as governance system. And it's a system where state security comes first, and where the rights of individuals and organizations are subordinate to that. And that also means that, for instance, when you have equivalence of terminology such as fairness and non-discrimination, at the same time you need to recognize that domestically those terms aren't necessarily interpreted in the same way. For instance, the Chinese government actively encourages facial recognition capabilities that have specific capabilities to monitor ethnic groups, certain ethnic groups within China. And these are, I think, some of the aspects, some of the more political aspects that make it a bit more challenging for governments to really find a consensus with China on AI governance going forward. This is not to say that engagement is impossible, and I do think that what we saw with the UK's AI Safety Summit was really a feat of diplomacy, bringing China to the table to discuss, really the lowest common denominator, I think, at this point, which is safety concerns for frontier models, was really, I think, a very good success on the part of the UK government. But going forward, the question is going to be how exactly to structure that engagement with China at the table to make sure that there can be progress on technical discussions without at the same time neglecting some of the more political motives that China has.
That's great. We're coming short to time, but I do want to have one last question to the panelists, and maybe I'm just going to pick up on where you left off, Rebecca, and ask what might we expect to see sort of in the short term, the next sort of 3 to 5 years, with respect to the US and the West broadly, and China on international cooperation on AI governance. Matt, any quick
what's going to happen in 3 to 5 years?
Oh, you forget the timeline. I mean, you define that out how you wish.
Yeah. I think the cooperation is going to be, obviously very much shaped by the geopolitical relationship. We happen to be in a relatively positive period for China's relations, at least with the US. I think also with EU and UK to a certain degree right now, leading up to Xi and Biden meeting at APEC later this week. So it's going to be very much dictated by that. I think maybe just one thing that I'd flag that goes under the radar on this topic is the fact that while handshake agreements or formal treaties between countries are going to be very hard to come by, especially on really tough AI questions around proliferation and stuff like that. But I think some of the engagement that Rebecca referred to earlier, a more grassroots level engagement, company to company, scientist to scientist, even sort of policy scholar to policy scholar, might be the most effective in this period of time. Like Chinese AI policy influencers, policymakers, policy scholars are very, very deeply engaged with and paying attention to what happens in the rest of the world. They want to talk to their counterparts in the EU and the US and elsewhere to share ideas, to understand more closely what these other countries are doing. And while China is not a country that sort of takes marching orders from anyone else, they're not going to govern AI one specific way just because someone in a developed country, someone in the West tells them to do it. They're very much taking on board those ideas and sort of integrating them with domestic Chinese considerations. And so I think one of the biggest and most kind of fruitful areas of engagement is outside of the official realm, scholars and scientists talking to one another directly about these issues, and then watching how those sort of seeds that get planted, how they develop differently in each country, how China's own domestic governance evolves on the basis of how it interacts with and ideas that it absorbs and shares with the rest of the world.
Great. Matt, look, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up here, but I want to thank both panelists for providing a huge amount of analysis and content in a very short time. I think we've only kind of touched the surface of what is a very important set of issues, but I want to thank both of you for engagement and time. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was challenging. You only had 20 minutes, but you managed to reach it. It was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as promised, it is lunchtime. Lunch will be served downstairs in the hotel restaurant. As you've noticed, we're running a little bit behind schedule, so we will meet back here 10 minutes after we were meant to meet. So at 2:10, we'll be back here with an action-packed programme for the afternoon. As I said, we'll have the European Commission, we'll have the view from DC, we'll have the view from UN, and Andrea will be sitting down as well with a very well-known data scientist. So in the meantime, bon appetit, and see you soon.